really closely into what's been done to make sure.
Stop. Rewind. Hey, rewind.
The system has been fixed. The devastating Optus outage that was linked to 3 deaths revealed we can't always trust we can get through when we call 000. More than 2 months later,
We got some things to go through or something. I'll have a look. I haven't put it on. This is the Optus outage for the telephone company.
surely the system has been fixed. Today, Consumer Affairs reporter Michael Atkin on why some people still can't get help when they need it most. I'm Sam Hawley on Gadigal land in Sydney. This is ABC News Daily.
The latest crisis for Optus began when a bungled network upgrade resulted in hundreds of calls to 000 failing.
The company now says that 480 000 calls didn't go through as the failure dragged on for 13 hours across 4 states.
To the families and friends of the people who passed away, I am so sorry for your loss. What has happened is completely unacceptable. We have let you down.
Michael, since that major Optus outage, you've been looking really closely into what's been done to make sure it doesn't happen again. But there was another death last week, wasn't there?
There was. It's hard to believe. So we learnt that a TPG customer in Sydney, they died after trying to use their mobile phone and not being able to reach 000 repeatedly.
TPG Telecom says a person died last Thursday after their relative was unable to make emergency calls. TPG says the failed calls were due to a Samsung device operating on software that wasn't compatible with making 000 calls on the network.
We don't know very much at all about what happened because the only information comes from a very brief statement from the telco. But it says it was informed of the incident involving a person. They were using its budget Labara service on a Samsung device, and the early investigations indicate that the failed calls were due to the customer's Samsung device operating on software that was not compatible with being able to make emergency calls on the Vodafone network. So, there's this issue that's existed for a while where Samsung has told them that certain devices, older devices, need this urgent software update in order to be able to make 000 calls. And this person, it appears, has not done that, but they were only given a few weeks to do it. And, I've been told by some customers that the whole process has been quite confusing and, it's unclear exactly what they need to do. And then when they sought help, it's been confusing from there.
So if you've got an old Samsung phone, you could be in trouble. Have you found out why that actually is? What's the problem there?
Look, it's complicated, but it's got to do with how the phone tries to search for a connection to the emergency network when you dial 000. It's a problem that has emerged since the 3G mobile network was turned off about a year ago, although there's variations between the different providers on the exact date. The specific issue has affected 11 older Samsung Galaxy phones, and some of them actually need to be completely replaced. They can't be fixed at all, whereas 60 other models, all it needs is this urgent software update. Telstra is the one who first identified this issue when it did urgent testing, and that affects not only Telstra customers, it affects Optus customers, TPG Vodafone customers and other customers because, we need to know that in network outages that your emergency call still goes through. The telcos are legally obliged to make sure that happens. But obviously with these Samsung phones, that's not been occurring.
No, and that's not the only problem people are facing, because there was also an outage, wasn't there, at Wollongong on the New South Wales south coast in late September. That led to 9 failed 000 calls. Just explain what happened there.
This was a problem with just one Optus mobile phone tower in the Dapto area. The outage affected calls between 3 a.m. and 12:20 p.m. on a Sunday, including these 9 000 calls. And it was this minor issue, but it had to do with the software that was being used on the tower and the equipment on the tower. But the key point is this should never happen. The telcos are legally obliged to make sure these emergency calls happen no matter what. And this was back-to-back weeks that this was happening with Optus, which really kicked off all this huge public concern about 000.
And since you've been investigating this, Michael, you're hearing complaints from individual customers about not being able to get through to emergency services. So what have you been told?
Look, I've spoken with 5 customers on the Optus network who all say they couldn't call 000 outside of network outages. So it raises this question as to whether there's a much broader problem with the Optus network or with the 000 ecosystem itself. In one of the alarming cases, this Melbourne woman was being robbed in the middle of the night by 2 men who broke into her home, and she actually saw one of them face to face.
Oh my gosh.
I woke up at like 3:45 and I saw a light moving all around this hallway. I felt like my heart was like beating in my throat.
He walked into her bedroom and luckily he fled after seeing she was away. And she was terrified. She was home alone because her partner was away.
I was just like petrified. Yeah, he came into my doorway, flashed his light around, saw that I was awake, and then thankfully he ran away.
And when she went to ring the police, she couldn't get through and she tried again and again and again.
I went to call 000 and it didn't work, and my heart stopped, and I tried it again and I tried it again, and it just said call cannot be completed.
And she was forced to message and call friends in the middle of the night until somebody finally woke up and called the police for her. And she was using her iPhone 13, so a relatively new phone, but she said it just didn't go through. I think unusually for her, she uses an American phone plan with T-Mobile, despite her living in Australia, because she travels to the US for work regularly. But when she's at home, her phone routinely connects to the Optus network using international roaming. And that's not as uncommon as it may sound because, you have international students, you have people here on working holidays or people just travelling. And so that's a fairly standard situation, actually.
I wouldn't say that I could trust them for it to work again, because I didn't know that it's happened before. You'd think after the first time they would be horrified and make sure that it doesn't happen again.
It's still under investigation who's to blame for those problems with her connecting and whether it was due to the Optus network or something else.
What an awful situation to be in, though. Tell me, what has Optus and the telecommunications industry had to say about that?
Look, for all of the cases, Optus said there were no network outages at the time, and they're continuing to look into these cases. In one of the cases I looked at, the Telenis, they tried from 2 mobile phones on the Optus network, and that had been looked at briefly by the communications regulator, ACMA, but the Telenis were frustrated because they said their problems were based on phone reception, and they don't have problems with phone reception, they said, and they successfully made calls to a hospital on the night in question.
In total, we rang 000 18 times, 7 from my phone and 11 times from my wife's phone. It wasn't a black spot. I was able to ring my wife. We were able to ring Concord Hospital. So it's just AAA did not work. And we know now as a fact it didn't work.
And they were frustrated that nobody had come out and tested their phones or done other testing with them. And it raises this question as to whether anybody at all is fully getting to the bottom of why these 000 calls are failing and working out whether it's a much broader problem with the system.
All right. Well, Michael, let's look at what has actually happened then since this major Optus outage. Now, there's been a fair bit of pressure on Optus. The Optus boss, he had to actually appear before a parliamentary inquiry. So tell me how that went.
Oh, look, it was a difficult front up for Stephen Rue and the other Optus executives.
Optus never detected the outage, which I'm shocked about.
Yes, Senator, that's correct.
For hours and hours and hours, Optus did not know what was going on.
Yes, so
One of the key things that came out was Stephen Rue being very contrite. He kept saying he was deeply sorry about what had happened, that it was unacceptable.
what happened on the 18th of September is unacceptable. As the CEO, I'm accountable for Optus's failings, and I'm deeply sorry. We are all deeply sorry.
But he also defended his own actions. He's resisted calls to resign, saying he's trying to change things and he's fairly new and change takes time.
Understandably, there are questions arising about my position, but I firmly believe that another change of leader at this time is not what Optus needs. The disruption and uncertainty could actually set back the transformation underway and create further risks.
They gave a very detailed timeline pushed by the politicians on why it took so long to detect the outage in the first place, because not only were people calling the Optus call centre repeatedly saying 000 is not working here, well, those calls were never escalated properly, but also Optus has admitted it could see from some of its own systems when it went back and checked that some of the calls weren't going through, but it failed to notice those warnings. And it was only when it started getting warnings from elsewhere, including from the South Australian Ambulance Service, that it finally noticed something was wrong and did something about it. But there's also these big questions as to what they were doing between the time they found out that 000 wasn't working. What came to light is that Optus was holding crisis meetings. They had 11 of them before they ended up telling the regulator and then the government that there were these bigger problems with hundreds of calls and that people had died. And during the hearing, one of the bits of evidence I really noticed is an Optus executive, Catherine Dyer. She's the chief operating officer. She told the committee that actually these welfare checks that they do when customers complain about having trouble reaching 000, that they're common, that actually it's something that they do almost every day, she said, and that these calls do fail regularly.
Senator, we do conduct welfare checks on quite a frequent basis. So we make welfare checks every day. So it's not uncommon for a telco to be making welfare checks.
And so that's a window that's starting to crack open into how widespread these problems might be.
Yeah, and it's so important, isn't it, that 000, it just works when we need it to work. How can we actually trust this system now? Should we trust it?
Well, I think that's the concern, is not enough of the public does trust it. And, you know, it's not just medical emergencies, it's things like when you need the police in an instant. And, you know, people need to know that's going to happen. Otherwise, there will be a real public crisis of confidence in the system. There are some people who believe more could be done to strengthen the system that's not been done yet. One proposal that's existed for some time is to include text messaging as part of the system. So, you know, if, for example, you couldn't make a phone call, maybe you were in a situation that was unsafe, like a domestic and family violence situation, or maybe you were just in an area with really bad phone reception and you couldn't call, but you could text message, that might be a way to get the police or an ambulance to you, and that might be crucial, say, in a bushfire where calls aren't working but maybe texts are getting through. I think these are the sorts of things that people are really wondering now. Is the system up to scratch? Because it's an old system. It's not fit for purpose for the current scenario where most people are making emergency calls from their mobile phone. And is it as robust as what we need it to be? And a lot of people are saying it's not.
Michael Atkin is the ABC's National Consumer Affairs reporter. This episode was produced by Sydney Peed and Cinnamon Nippard. Audio production by Sam Dunn. Our supervising producer is David Cody. I'm Sam Hawley. Thanks for listening.
Epstein files, this was about a week and a half ago, even if they had him.
ABC Listen. Me and the sharpest political minds at the ABC.
Ritual humiliation at which everybody...
Hi, I'm Patricia Carvelis, host of Politics Now, the ABC's podcast unpacking the latest political news. Every week you'll hear me and the sharpest political minds at the ABC.
Ritual humiliation at which everybody laughs and pretends to be entertained by Donald Trump. That's on the Trump bingo card.
So join me for Politics Now on the ABC Listen app.
He's called a female journalist piggy, labelled another insubordinate, and demanded Democratic politicians be arrested, even suggesting they could be executed for seditious behaviour. Sounds like a pretty normal week for Donald Trump, but is it? Today's staff writer from The Atlantic magazine, Tom Nichols, on why the president's latest outbursts are a sign he's losing control of himself. I'm Sam Hawley on Gadigal land in Sydney. This is ABC News Daily. Tom, we're pretty used to outbursts from Donald Trump at this point, but in the past week or so, you think that we've seen a remarkable shift. Now, before we delve into that, let's just consider, first of all, some of the things he's been saying and doing. Now, why don't we just start with one of the more outrageous ones, which is when he lashed out at a female journalist and called her piggy.
Yeah, he was on Air Force One, and a female reporter asked him if he would still support releasing the Epstein files. This was about a week and a half ago, even if they had him in it and if it were damaging and so on. And he said, "Quiet, piggy."
There's nothing incriminating in the files, sir.
Which, was really, even by Donald Trump's standards, shocking. I mean, he shows a lot of hostility toward reporters and especially toward women, but he really seems to be kind of losing control of himself. He usually can hold back a bit. He'll normally say something like, "You're a terrible reporter," or "That's fake news." "What network are you with? They're awful." But calling somebody a woman piggy, he always has kind of reveled in saying things that would probably get him called out onto the sidewalk if he weren't the president. But even by his very low standards, that was kind of a shock.
Yeah.
And his supporters tried to rationalize it. He didn't really say that. He got her name wrong and so on, but nobody's buying that story. He seems to be kind of losing his grip.
Yeah, but Carolyn Levitt, his press secretary at the White House, she even defended the remarks. And she's a woman.
What did the president mean when he called a reporter piggy?
Look, the president is very frank and honest with everyone in this room. You've all seen it yourself. You've all experienced it yourselves. And I think it's one of the many reasons that the American people reelected this president, because of his frankness.
Well, Carolyn Levitt she's the press secretary for a reason, which is that she will defend anything Donald Trump does. And that's why she's there. She has no background in journalism or the press. She's a Trump loyalist. That's her job, and no one should be surprised by that, even though she's a woman. The Trump administration doesn't really think in terms of men or women or white or black or up or down or left or right. They think in terms of people who support us and enemies, and that's it. That's the only two classes of people in the Trump administration's world.
All right, well, Tom, after this, the president sits down with the Saudi crown prince, a man who US intelligence has found ordered the murder of American journalist Jamal Khashoggi. And he again lashes out at another female reporter, doesn't he?
Yeah, again, I think it's showing the strain getting to him. That because I think this is all about the Epstein files. And once again, this time he did his more standard kind of reaction. Your fake news, terrible network. And then he added that he was going to tell America's Federal Communications Commission to look into ABC's license.
Mr. President, why wait for Congress to release the Epstein files? Why not just do it now?
You're a terrible person and a terrible reporter. People are wise to your hoax, and ABC's your company, your crappy company, is one of the perpetrators. And I'll tell you something.
So why not just sign it now?
I think the license should be taken away from ABC because your news is so fake and it's so wrong. And we have a great commissioner, the chairman, who should look at that because
which is something, again, he's resorted to in the past of making this kind of threat because the president, unfortunately, has a very kind of childlike understanding of the presidency. And he thinks that, everything that goes on in the world is something that he can license or permit or prevent. But again, it was a very uncomfortable moment and an embarrassing one for the United States, of course.
And of course, there is more, Tom. Much more. The president also called for the arrest and, wait for it, the execution of elected American officials. What was that about?
Yeah, this is where I think it's always a risky thing to say, this is where Donald Trump went over the line. But this is where I think we saw something qualitatively new. He's always talked about his opponents and his enemies as vermin and scum and terrible people. But he identified these 6 members of Congress, all of whom were veterans of either the military or the national security community, and said that he wanted them arrested and tried for sedition, which, of course, he kept adding carries the death penalty. And their crime, in his eyes, they were reminding senior officers of the U.S. military that they must refuse to obey illegal orders.
Our laws are clear. You can refuse illegal orders.
You can refuse illegal orders.
You must refuse illegal orders.
No one has to carry out orders that violate the law or our Constitution.
We know this
with the president using the military in American cities and with a string of strikes on the high seas where he's killing people at will, these members of Congress stepped forward and said, remember, your duty is to refuse illegal orders. And that really made the president pop a gasket. And the Secretary of Defense, or as he styles himself, calls himself the Secretary of War, said that he's going to look into one of those senators, Mark Kelly, who is a retired naval officer, and consider bringing him back to the service and court-martialing him. And of course, nothing's going to really come of that. It's absurd, but it shows you how wired and I think terrified the White House is about these files.
There was another moment I just wanted to raise with you before we move on, because he also sat down with Zoran Mamdani, the incoming New York mayor, and that was a rather warm affair, given he is very critical of the president.
But I just want to congratulate. I think you're going to have hopefully a really great mayor. The better he does, the happier I am, I will say. There's no difference in party. There's no difference in anything. And we're going to be helping him to make everybody's dream come true, having a strong and very safe New York. And congratulations, Mr. Mayor. Thank you, Mr. President.
What did you make of that?
Right. Donald Trump really has no internal political compass. Mamdani came in and was, cheerful and charismatic and respectful and put on a good face. And, that was enough for Donald Trump. And all of the other stuff about how he's a communist and he's going to ruin New York and all of that kind of went out the window because Donald Trump is a vain man who is easily wowed by celebrity. And one thing I think that really had an effect here is that Mamdani is kind of a celebrity now. And Trump clearly enjoys that.
All right, well, Tom, let's then turn to your thesis, and that is that President Trump is losing control of himself, which you say is sort of worse than losing control of, say, a policy agenda, right?
Yeah, I mean, he's the president of the United States. He commands the most powerful military in the world. He has the codes to thousands of nuclear weapons. You know, we're watching a man have, in my view, and I'm not a doctor, I'm just a man looking at another human being here, you know, he seems to be melting down. The insults and the lashing out and the threats. We're used to some of that from Donald Trump because he is a showman. And he does that because he looks at everything through the lens of television. These outbursts, including these threats to arrest and try and execute members of Congress, tells you, I think, that this is somebody who's really losing his grip on himself and on the situation. And I think part of the way you know that is no one's really been able to step in front of this and stop it. It's almost like he has no staff anymore. I mean, they're all a sycophantic circle, to be sure, but in earlier years, and certainly in his first administration, even within that circle of sycophants, there were people who would step forward and say, look, Mr. President, it's a bad idea, you know, and you probably shouldn't be saying stuff like this. I mean, he is unbound now, and I think everybody should be concerned when the President of the United States appears to be having problems with his emotional stability.
And you don't think we should just be treating this as just another episode of the Trump reality show? You do think that this is substantially different than what we've seen from him before?
It feels that way to me. I've been watching him for a long time, and you can almost tell when he's play acting. I mean, he has very set phrases, and he kind of rehashes certain kinds of grievances. But as another American commentator, as Bill Kristol pointed out, it seemed on Thursday last week that he hadn't slept well. He said, I wonder, you know, if he just hadn't had a good night's sleep worrying about all this stuff, because all of this lashing out has been growing with the impending release of the Epstein files. I think the stress is getting to him. And that to me seems different than his usual kind of role playing of the wrestling world heel or the bad executive on a TV show or something. This feels to me like he's really showing us a man who's cornered and scared.
You say it reminds you of the Nixon years, so just explain why that is.
Well, at the end of Richard Nixon's, just before he left office in his second term, he was lashing out within the White House, and people were worried about his rationality. He was reportedly drinking too much, you know, just really showing the immense strain of a man whose entire presidency was collapsing under a scandal. The Secretary of Defense at the time, James Schlesinger, was so concerned that he reached out to the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff and said, look, if you get any unusual orders coming out of the White House, double check them with me. Which probably isn't constitutional, but it showed that there were people in the Nixon White House that were very worried about the president's state of mind. I would argue that where Donald Trump is right now in public is vastly beyond anywhere Nixon was toward the end of his time in office. I mean, Nixon had a much more professional group of people around him and a lot more self-control than Donald Trump. And yet there were people in 1974 very concerned about his emotional and mental stability.
Donald Trump is a teetotaler, though, isn't he? Just to make that point, he does not drink.
No, Donald Trump is famously a teetotaler, but he's also, I would argue, compared to Richard Nixon, a man much more enslaved to his own impulses, really incapable of kind of, editing himself or, having any kind of inner monologue. I mean, Donald Trump, as we've seen in these Fidel Castro-like hours-long, speeches that he gives, if he thinks it, he says it. It comes out of him. And especially with a phone in his hand, when he can tweet things or post things on his Truth Social, he's almost unstoppable in a way that I think even Richard Nixon would have realized that there are some things that, saying them in public is probably a bad idea.
All right, well, Tom, if your thesis is right and Donald Trump continues down this path, what does that mean? What comes next? What does it mean for the American people?
Well, it means, I think, that they have to pay very close attention to their government in a way that they haven't thought to do, that they probably should have been doing earlier, but that Americans need to have discussions among themselves about, this isn't an act anymore, and that they shouldn't treat it as just another episode of the Trump reality show. I think for members of Congress, they really have to start doing their job. Even the Republicans, which I think is starting to happen. You're starting to see some dissent finally, after all these years, starting to percolate in the Republican Party, but that they have to just keep an eye on him. This White House is, completely bunkered down around Donald Trump. It's not like they're going to admit that anything's wrong, but members of Congress and people, ordinary citizens really need to be paying closer attention.
Tom Nichols is a staff writer at The Atlantic. This episode was produced by Sydney Peed. Audio production by Sam Dunn. Our supervising producer is David Cody. I'm Sam Hawley. I'm off for a few weeks, so thank you for your company throughout.
All right. I've done the recording. What do I think about Donald Trump? He's all right. He's doing his best to getting Venezuela, president out of Venezuela, Nicolas Maduro, Middle East, European conflicts. Donald Trump's all right, I suppose. I'm going to let you go. Hope you listen to it as well. I'm intermixhector. Subscribe.